6 days. That's what the bank gave me before the equipment loan on my father's farm went into default, a loan I didn't take out, on land I didn't yet legally own. 2 nights after his funeral, before the dirt on his grave had even settled flat, a lawyer I had never met called my cell phone about a second will. I grew up the youngest of 3 boys in Callaway County, Missouri, on 210 acres my great-grandfather had cleared with a mule and a broken plow. My brother Mark became a surgeon in St. Louis. My brother Ryan built a real estate portfolio worth, by his own estimate, 7 figures. I dropped out of the agricultural program at Mizzou in my 2nd year, failed at a hardware store business with a partner who disappeared with the inventory, went through a divorce that took the house, and spent most of my 30s doing seasonal ranch work in 3 different states, coming home only for holidays and funerals. At every Thanksgiving table, someone found a polite way to ask what I was doing with my life. I never had a good answer. By the time I turned 38, I had accepted the shape everyone else had already given me. I was the one who didn't turn out. The morning of my father's funeral, I stood in the kitchen where I'd eaten 10,000 breakfasts, and the house still smelled like it always had. Diesel from his boots by the door, coffee boiled too long on the stove, the particular dust of dry hay drifting in through a screen door that never quite latched. Sunlight came in low and yellow across the linoleum, the way it always did at 6 in the morning in early October, and for 1 second, I forgot he was gone. My father wasn't a talker. He showed love the way farmers of his generation did. A hand on the shoulder, a truck gassed up and waiting, silence that meant I see you more than any sentence could. He and I had spent thousands of hours together checking fence line and walking the north field at dusk, him crouching to rub soil between his fingers like he was reading a letter from someone he trusted. He never explained what he was looking for. I never asked. Now I wished I had asked everything. There's a memory I kept circling back to that week, one I hadn't thought about in over 20 years. I was maybe 16, failing algebra, certain I was about to disappoint everyone in a new and creative way. And he'd pulled me out to the north field on a Tuesday evening, instead of making me sit with my textbook. He didn't lecture me. He just handed me a trowel and told me to dig a hole a foot deep and tell him what I saw. I remember complaining that dirt was dirt. He crouched down next to me, worked a clump of it apart with his thumbs and said, "Everybody looks at the same ground and sees the same nothing. Difference is what you do about it." At the time, I thought it was one of his throwaway farm sayings. Standing in that kitchen the morning of his funeral, it didn't feel like a saying anymore. It felt like a door I hadn't known I was supposed to walk through. In the study off the kitchen sat his roll-top desk, and inside its locked bottom drawer were 3 cracked leather notebooks I'd seen my whole life and never once opened. He kept them the way some men keep a gun safe, not hidden exactly, just closed. Understood by everyone in the house to be his and no one else's. Nobody had touched that drawer since the day the ambulance came. I remember standing over it the morning of the funeral, running my thumb along the brass keyhole, feeling a pull toward it I couldn't explain, and then walking away because the house was already filling with relatives and casseroles, and there wasn't time. I told myself I'd come back to it. I didn't, not for 6 more weeks, and by the time I finally did, I would already be almost out of them. Tomorrow, the lawyer said, they would read the will. And already standing in that kitchen, I knew exactly what my brothers' faces would do the moment they learned the farm. All of it. The deed, the equipment, the debt, the 210 acres my father had bled for, was going to me alone. The reading happened in a strip mall law office in Fulton, fluorescent lights humming over a conference table too small for the 6 of us. Mark flew in from St. Louis in a suit that cost more than my truck. Ryan drove up from Kansas City already checking his phone before he sat down. Our mother had passed 4 years earlier, so it was just us, 3 brothers and a stranger, in a cheap tie holding a folder that was about to detonate the room. The numbers came first. Mark received $340,000 from a life insurance policy and investment accounts. Ryan received $280,000 plus a portfolio of dividend-paying stocks our father had quietly built for decades. I received the farm, 210 acres, a farmhouse in need of a new roof, a barn with a leaning east wall, $46,000 of debt on a used combine and a grain drill, and $12,000 cash to, as the will put it, get him started. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute. Then Ryan laughed, not a happy sound. He's giving Daniel the one asset that actually loses money every year. It isn't managed by somebody who knows what they're doing. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the lawyer like I wasn't in the room, like this was a business dispute and I was a line item. Mark was quieter, which was worse. He asked the lawyer calmly, clinically, whether our father had been of sound mind, whether there had been a diagnosis, a decline, anything that might explain a decision that, his word, doesn't track. The lawyer assured him there had been 2 independent capacity evaluations in the year before the will was finalized, both clean. Our father had known precisely what he was doing. I sat there and said almost nothing, because there was a version of me, the version everyone at that table believed in, who agreed with them. Why me? I'd failed at nearly everything I'd tried. I didn't have Mark's discipline or Ryan's instinct for money. What I had was $46,000 of debt due in 6 days, on a piece of land nobody in the family thought I could keep, let alone run. Mark asked to see the will's language a second time, reading it over the lawyer's shoulder like he was looking for a typo that would fix everything. Ryan pulled out his phone and started typing before we'd even left the building. A text to Danny, I found out later, asking him to pull comparable sales on the property that same afternoon, as if the ink on the will wasn't dry and he'd already begun planning how to undo it. Neither of them asked me a single question. Not what I thought, not what I wanted, not whether I was scared. In their eyes, I wasn't a person who just lost his father and inherited a farm. I was a problem that needed managing, the same way I'd been a problem to manage since I was 22 and dropped out of Mizzou with nothing to show for 2 years of tuition. The lawyer slid one more document across the table, a letter, sealed, addressed to me in my father's handwriting. I didn't open it there. I put it in my jacket pocket and drove 2 hours back to the farm alone, my brothers' voices still ringing in my ears, already composing the argument they'd have on the drive home about how this could still be fixed, how land could still be sold, how $12,000 in a shed full of equipment wasn't a farm. It was a burden with fences. Halfway home, I pulled over on the shoulder of Route Z, cut the engine, and sat with my hands still on the wheel for longer than I want to admit. I thought about every conversation at every family gathering where somebody's tone had shifted slightly softer when they talked to me, the way people talk to someone they've stopped expecting much from. I thought about how easy it would be to prove them right one more time, sign whatever papers Danny put in front of me, take a third of whatever the developer offered, and let the farm become somebody's cul-de-sac. Nobody would have blamed me. Some part of me suspected they were already expecting exactly that. What none of us knew yet, what I wouldn't understand for another 6 weeks, was that my father hadn't left me a burden at all. He'd left me a question, and the answer was locked in a drawer I hadn't opened. I moved into the farmhouse permanently 3 days after the reading, sleeping in my childhood bedroom because I couldn't bring myself to take my parents' room yet. The bank called on day 4, then day 5. A loan officer named Pruitt, with a voice like a man reading from a script he didn't enjoy. He explained patiently that the estate transfer paperwork gave me a narrow window, that the note was in my name now whether I wanted it or not, and that without a payment or a restructuring agreement by the end of the week, the bank would begin repossession proceedings on the combine and grain drill, the 2 pieces of equipment I needed to plant anything at all. I drove into Fulton and sat across a different desk, this one belonging to a woman named Carol, who'd worked with my father for 11 years. She was kind, but the math wasn't. The farm had run at a loss for the last 3 seasons. My father's health had been declining longer than any of us admitted, and the fields showed it. Yields on the South 40 were down almost 1/3 from a decade earlier. The soil tests she pulled up looked tired. Low organic matter, compacted subsoil, nitrogen numbers that meant another season of expensive synthetic fertilizer just to break even. She didn't say the word hopeless. She didn't have to. That same week, my cousin Danny, a title attorney who did occasional work for Ryan, showed up unannounced with a folder of comparable land sales. A developer out of Columbia was buying up acreage along Highway 54 for a subdivision, he said, and had already expressed informal interest in the farm if I wanted to talk numbers. He framed it as a favor. I recognized it as a scouting trip for my brother. Ryan called that night. He didn't dress it up. "Nobody's saying you're stupid, Daniel. We're saying you're set up to fail, and it's not your fault this time. It's Dad's. Sell it, split it 3 ways like it should have been from the start, and none of us have to watch you lose the thing on top of everything else." I hung up without answering. I sat on the back porch in the dark, my father's letter still unopened in a drawer of my own now, and for the first time since the funeral, I let myself consider that they might be right. A different kind of pressure showed up a week later, and this one didn't come from family. Harold Beeler farmed the section south of ours, a man who'd known my father for 30 years and had never once, in my memory, spoken a kind word about anyone's farming decisions but his own. He caught me at the co-op picking up fence wire and didn't bother with hello. "Heard you're keeping the place," he said like an accusation. "Your daddy let that ground run down the last few years. Everybody in the county knows it. You planning on catching it up with what, good intentions?" He wasn't cruel about it exactly. Harold was like that with everyone, blunt as a fence post. But it landed harder, coming from someone who'd actually watched my father work that land for 3 decades, and clearly didn't believe there was anything worth salvaging in what he'd left behind. I drove home with his voice looping in my head, layering on top of Ryan's, on top of Carol's soil numbers, on top of 20 years of holiday dinners where I'd been the answer to nobody's expectations. I want to be honest that this was the lowest point before things turned. I remember standing in the equipment shed that evening, looking at a combine I couldn't afford to keep and couldn't afford to lose, thinking that maybe the family'd been right about me for reasons that had nothing to do with fairness. Maybe I really was the wrong person for this. It would have been so easy in that shed at that hour to call Danny back and tell him to set up a meeting with the developer. 2 days later, I ran into Wendell Cass at the feed store. 61 years old, farmed the section next to ours for as long as I could remember. One of the only men my father had ever called a friend. Wendell looked at me for a long moment over a stack of fence posts and said something that stopped me cold. "Your daddy told me once the North Field was going to outyield every piece of ground in this county inside of 5 years. Said he had a method nobody else was doing right. I thought it was just talk. Man kept everything close." He shrugged, like it was nothing, and went back to loading his truck. I drove home faster than I should have. I couldn't get Wendell's words out of my head for the rest of that day. My father had never once, in 38 years, told me he thought the North Field was capable of anything. If anything, he'd talked about that section the way you'd talk about a stubborn old dog, with a kind of resigned affection, never with ambition. Hearing that he'd told someone else, a neighbor, something he'd never said to his own son, stung in a way I didn't expect. But underneath the sting was something sharper. Curiosity. If he'd said it to Wendell, he'd said it for a reason. And men like my father didn't say things without meaning to eventually act on them. I went straight to the study, to the roll-top desk, to the locked bottom drawer I'd walked away from twice already. I found the key in a coffee can on the workbench, exactly where he'd kept every key to everything his whole life, and I opened it. 3 notebooks, leather cracked soft with age, pages filled edge to edge in his small, slanted handwriting, dates, columns of numbers, sketches of field sections, and notations in a shorthand that meant nothing to me. Words like N-fix rest, wire 3, and clover till, do not disturb till May, and strings of numbers I couldn't connect to anything. 12 years of entries. 12 years of something he'd been doing on the North Field that not one of us had ever asked about, because we'd never once thought to wonder what he did out there alone at dusk. I sat at that desk until 2 in the morning and understood almost none of it. But I understood enough to know it wasn't nothing. I spent that first night with the notebook spread across the kitchen table the way I imagined detectives spread evidence, except the man I was trying to understand was my own father, and the case I was building was against everything I'd assumed about who he'd been. The earliest entries, 12 years back, read almost like a stranger's, cautious, full of question marks, entries that started with phrases like, tried again, still not right, and check with the extension office, maybe I'm wrong about this. It didn't sound like the quiet, certain man I'd grown up with. It sounded like someone who doubted himself constantly and kept working anyway, which was somehow harder to reconcile than if he'd simply been the natural at everything my brothers assumed he must have been to leave me something this complicated. By the 3rd notebook, the handwriting changed. Steadier, more confident, fewer question marks, more numbers. Whatever he'd been chasing in that first volume, he'd found enough of it by the 3rd to stop doubting and start refining. I sat there until 2 in the morning turning pages, and somewhere around midnight I stopped trying to decode the shorthand and started just reading it as what it actually was. 12 years of a man teaching himself something nobody else in his life cared enough to learn alongside him. What I found over the following days, piecing it together with a legal pad, a farming almanac, and eventually 3 phone calls to Wendell, was that my father had spent over a decade quietly running an experiment most conventional farmers in the county would have laughed at. He'd been rebuilding the North Field soil from the ground up, a rotation of nitrogen-fixing cover crops timed to exact windows most guides considered too narrow to be practical, paired with a no-till method he'd adapted after years of failed attempts, and a mycorrhizal inoculation technique he'd learned from an old dry land farming manual and modified through trial and error nobody else witnessed. Yields on paper looked unimpressive for the first several years. That's why nobody noticed. Why the bank's soil reports on the rest of the farm looked so grim, while this one 22-acre section quietly built itself into something else entirely. The notebooks didn't hand me a finished recipe. They handed me a decade of half-finished sentences, revised timelines, crossed-out mistakes, and a system that made sense only if you understood the logic underneath it, which I didn't. Not yet. What they did make clear was the condition wrapped inside the discovery. This wasn't a shortcut. Following it meant committing the whole farm in the middle of a drought forecast and a 6-day loan deadline that had already become a 30-day negotiated extension I'd fought hard for, to a method that would very likely make things look worse before it made them better. The notebooks were blunt about that. One entry, dated 8 years back, simply read, "Year 1 always looks like failure. Don't panic. Panic is how people quit right before it works." I sat with that sentence for a long time. It felt like it had been written for me specifically, 12 years before I'd need to read it. I called Ryan and told him I wasn't selling. He told me I was making the same mistake I always made, betting everything on a feeling instead of a plan. I didn't correct him because from the outside, that's exactly what it looked like. I didn't have proof yet. I had 3 notebooks and a dead man's shorthand and a friend of his who remembered one offhand comment at a feed store. Wendell became my translator. 3 evenings a week, we sat at my kitchen table with the notebook spread between us, and he filled in what he could from memory. Things my father had mentioned in passing over 40 years of fence-line conversations that Wendell had filed away without realizing they'd matter. Some of the shorthand he recognized instantly. Some of it took us hours to untangle, cross-referencing dates against old almanacs and county extension bulletins from decades back that my father had apparently studied, and then quietly abandoned in favor of his own modified version. My first attempt was a disaster, and I want to be honest about that, because the notebooks had warned me and I didn't listen closely enough. I misread a timing window on the south test plot, 3 acres I'd set aside to practice on before risking the whole north field, and planted a cover crop 2 weeks late. The frost caught it. What should have been a modest proof of concept came up thin and yellow, and I stood at the edge of that field, feeling every name my family had ever called me settle back onto my shoulders like it had never actually left. But what I didn't know yet was that the mistake taught me something the notebooks alone couldn't. I had to stop treating my father's system like a manual and start treating it like a conversation. He hadn't written a recipe. He'd written down 12 years of a relationship with a piece of land, and a relationship isn't followed, it's learned. My second attempt, this time with Wendell walking the north field with me every step, went differently. We inoculated the seed the way the third notebook described. A step I'd skipped the first time because I hadn't understood why it mattered, and we timed the till exactly to the narrow window my father had circled in red ink 3 separate years in a row, like he was reminding himself as much as anyone else. It felt less like farming and more like following a set of directions left by someone who trusted I'd eventually be ready to read them. The bank called again in the middle of all this. Pruitt's patience had run out. The 30-day extension was closing, and without a restructuring plan backed by demonstrable progress, the equipment was going to be seized regardless of what was growing in the ground. Carol helped me put together a proposal. A partial payment from the $12,000 cash, a signed statement from the county extension office confirming the North Field trial was underway, and a promise, thin as paper, that the harvest would show something worth waiting for. It was enough to buy 90 more days. Barely. A second crisis hit in late May, this one with no lesson written down anywhere in the notebooks to guide me. A wet week, followed by a sudden heat spike, brought on an aphid outbreak that spread fast across the young cover crop, the kind of thing that could undo months of careful timing in a matter of days. My first instinct was to reach for the same broad-spectrum spray every conventional farmer in the county used without a second thought. Fast, cheap, and according to the notebooks, exactly the kind of shortcut my father had spent a decade trying to avoid. Because it would have killed off the same fungal networks and beneficial insect populations the whole method depended on. I called Wendell in a panic, and instead of an answer, he asked me a question my father used to ask him decades earlier. What did the field actually need, not what was fastest? We spent 2 days walking the rows by hand, identifying which sections were worst hit, and applying a targeted insect-specific treatment Wendell remembered my father experimenting with years before. Slower, more labor-intensive, and it turned out precise enough to spare the microbial work already happening underground. It wasn't in any notebook. It was in Wendell's memory of a man who'd never stopped teaching, even when he thought no one was paying attention. That second test, proving I could adapt the method under pressure, not just follow it on paper, mattered more to me than I expected. The first attempt had taught me to respect the system. This one taught me I might actually be capable of thinking inside it, the way my father had, instead of just copying his notes like a student who'd never understand the material well enough to improvise. Ryan showed up unannounced in the middle of June, driving out from Kansas City in a car that looked wrong parked next to my truck and Wendell's tractor. He walked the edge of the north field with his hands in his pockets, looking at knee-high seedlings that, to an untrained eye, looked exactly like every other struggling planting he'd ever mocked. "This is what you're betting the whole thing on," he said. It wasn't a question. Dad's diary and a neighbor's memory. I didn't have an answer that would have satisfied him, because the truth was I didn't fully trust it myself yet. That night, alone on the porch, I came closer to quitting than at any point since the funeral. I looked out at that field in the dark and saw thin, unimpressive rows and thought about how easy it would be to call the developer's number Danny had left on my counter, split whatever came from a sale 3 ways, and go back to being the brother nobody expected anything from. At least that failure would be familiar. What stopped me was the notebook, open on the kitchen table where I'd left it, that one line still underlined in my father's hand. Year 1 always looks like failure. Don't panic. He hadn't written it for a stranger. He'd written it, I understood now, for whichever one of us finally opened that drawer. I sat with that line until it stopped feeling like advice and started feeling like the closest thing to a conversation I was ever going to get with him again. I thought about the 16-year-old version of me kneeling in that same field with a trowel, being told that everybody looks at the same ground and sees the same nothing. I understood finally, sitting there in the dark with the porch light off and the field silent in front of me, that he hadn't handed me the farm because he believed I was already capable. He'd handed it to me because it was the one place left where capability could still be built. Slowly, the way he'd built his own, through failure that looked like failure right up until it didn't. I didn't call the developer's number that night. I went to bed instead, and in the morning, I called Wendell and asked what came next. By August, something changed that even I could see without Wendell standing next to me pointing it out. Missouri had its worst drought in 6 years that summer. Creeks running low across the county, neighboring fields browning by mid-July. 3 farmers I knew personally filing for disaster relief before harvest even started. The north field, though, held its color. The soil my father had spent a decade rebuilding, dense with organic matter, laced with the fungal networks his inoculation method had cultivated, structured to hold moisture the way compacted, chemical-dependent ground simply couldn't. Didn't crack the way the rest of the county's fields did. It didn't thrive despite the drought. It thrived because of everything he'd done to prepare it for exactly this kind of year. The county extension agent, a woman named Priya Deshmukh, who'd been skeptical when I first called her office in the spring, drove out in September and walked the field with a soil probe and a look on her face I hadn't expected, something close to disbelief. She pulled samples from 3 different sections and compared them, on the spot, to numbers from a county-wide drought year survey she happened to have on her tablet. The North Field's yield projection wasn't just good. It was nearly double the county average for that growing season, in a year when doubling anything was almost unheard of. Harvest came in October, almost exactly 1 year after the funeral. Wendell drove the combine my father had once trained me on as a teenager, back before I'd convinced myself I wasn't cut out for any of this. I rode alongside, watching grain pour gold into the trailer, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't waiting for someone to tell me I'd gotten it wrong. Priya came out the following week with 2 colleagues from the regional extension network, walking the field with a kind of quiet excitement she didn't try to hide anymore. She told me, almost as an aside, that she wanted to write the North Field up as a case study for other farmers dealing with degraded soil and worsening drought years. That what my father had built alone, without a single grant or research partner, was further along than some of the pilot programs the university itself had been running with full funding. I remember standing in the field listening to her and thinking about Harold Beeler's voice at the co-op, and how strange it was that the same ground he'd written off as ruined was now something a state agronomist wanted to study. Mark came out for the last day of harvest. I hadn't expected him to. He stood at the edge of the field in loafers that were immediately ruined, and he didn't say much, which from Mark was its own kind of apology. He asked, at one point, why our father had never told any of us what he was working on. I didn't have a clean answer. The best I could offer was that some men don't share what they're not finished proving yet, and maybe he was still proving it to himself right up until the year he died. Mark nodded, like that made more sense to him than he expected it to. Ryan called 2 weeks later, quieter than I'd heard him in years, and asked if I'd walk him through the notebooks sometime, not to challenge them, to understand them. He didn't apologize outright. That wasn't really Ryan's language, but he asked more questions in that one phone call than he'd asked me in the previous decade combined. And for the first time in my life, I felt like my own brother was actually curious about who I was instead of certain he already knew. I finished the harvest wearing my father's old canvas work coat, the one that had hung by the back door since the morning of the funeral, stiff with a year of not being touched. It still smelled faintly like diesel and cut hay. I hadn't planned to wear it. I'd just reached for it that morning the way I used to reach for my own jacket, and it fit. Not perfectly, but close enough that it felt less like wearing something that belonged to him, and more like stepping into something we now shared. The $12,000 my father left me to get started was long gone by then, spent on inoculant and diesel and a loan payment. Pruitt's office had finally stopped calling about. What I had instead was something none of the money my brothers received could have bought them. 3 notebooks now fully translated and copied out clean. A working method proven against the hardest growing season the county had seen in years, and a field that would carry my father's 12 years of quiet, unglamorous work forward instead of letting it die in a locked drawer. I copied the notebooks a second time that winter and gave a set to the county extension office at Priya's request, so other farmers struggling through the same tired soil and worsening droughts could learn what one man had spent a decade figuring out alone and never told a soul, not even his own sons. I kept the originals in the roll-top desk, unlocked now, the key sitting openly in the coffee can where it had always belonged. I used to believe success meant becoming someone different than the man I actually was. Sharper, richer, more like my brothers. less like the person everyone at every holiday table had quietly written off. Standing in that field the year after my father died, watching grain that shouldn't have survived a drought pour steady and gold into a trailer, I understood it differently. My father hadn't left me the smallest inheritance. He'd left me the only one that couldn't be spent. A set of instructions for becoming exactly who I already was, if I was willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of learning to read them. That winter, on a cold Sunday with nothing pressing to do, I finally opened the sealed letter that had sat in my jacket pocket since the day of the will reading, then in a kitchen drawer for the better part of a year after. It wasn't long. My father was never a man who wasted words even on paper. It said, in part, that he'd watched me longer and closer than I ever gave him credit for, that he'd seen a kind of stubbornness in me the others didn't have, the kind that came back to something after it failed instead of walking away from it entirely. And that stubbornness, more than any diploma or dividend, was the only thing that could actually finish what he'd started in that field. He wrote that he was sorry he hadn't said any of it out loud while he still could. He wrote that he trusted me with it anyway. I keep that letter in the same drawer as the notebooks now, unlocked, the coffee can with its single brass key sitting open on the desk where anyone in the family is welcome to find it. Ryan comes out most Octobers now to help with harvest, less because the farm needs the extra hands and more, I think, because he wants to understand a version of success he never learned to recognize growing up. Mark still wears the wrong shoes every time. 6 days, once, was all the time I thought I had. A year later, I finally understood what he'd actually given me was never about the deadline at all. It was about everything that could grow, quietly, underground, long before anyone thought to look.